Well, welcome everybody to the Beards and Bible podcast. I am Gabe, and I am not joined by my friend and accomplice Josh Brooker in this episode because he is out gallivanting around, Lord knows where. But he has turned over the controls to me in this episode, and that is terrifying because I have no idea what I'm doing behind the wheel here of this recording software. So if I sound like my voice is going through a Yoda filter, that's why, from Star Wars. But hopefully it all works out, Lord willing. But this episode, as you have heard in the bumper, is the other opposing viewpoint to our In the Ring series that we did with King James only or not to King James only. And so my guest is Nick Sayers, and I want to welcome him on the podcast. And Nick, you want to say hello to the Beards and Bible audience?
Hey, Beards and Bible audience. Good to be here. I really appreciate the invite. And I'm in sunny Australia. We have summer here. And so it's very hot at the moment. We've got 38 degrees some days here. So it's very hot over Christmas. But yeah, thanks for inviting me on your program.
Absolutely. I think you are definitely our first Australian guest, and it's just amazing that we have the internet makes it where we can close that geographical gap and have these kinds of conversations real time with each other. It's just amazing. Yeah. So you are in the obviously the southern hemisphere. It is summer. I am in Alabama, and it is winter, but fortunately I'm in the southern United States, and it is sunny here as well, much to the chagrin of everyone in the northern United States. But Nick, I want to just open up and just let you tell me a little bit about yourself. You talk about how you found me and why you chose to accept the invitation to come on the podcast.
Okay, so I was tagged in a post probably about 3 weeks ago, maybe a month ago, by Eric Couture, I think you pronounce his last name. And Eric's done between 70 and 80 videos talking about the King James movement and modern Bibles, and he talks a lot about that. So he came out of King James onlyism. So he tagged me when you said that you were looking for someone to represent the King James only side. I do get labeled King James only. It is an interesting thing to go through and try and define that term, because some people would say I'm definitely not King James only. Other people constantly harass me and say that you have to admit the sin of being a King James only cultist sort of thing. And so, but yeah, that's how I found your podcast, and I've listened to your views on the King James. A few months ago, you did a podcast, and I would disagree, but we can still be friends.
No, it's impossible.
No,
Oh yeah. Well, I just trim mine nice and short, so it's okay. Yeah, and I appreciate you taking the time to listen to that and getting kind of our views on the King James only stance and all. And yeah, I appreciate you taking the time to come on the podcast and talk to us and have a conversation about it because 2 weeks ago we uploaded an opposing viewpoint on why King James only, according to his assessment, is not defensible, and why it's important that we not believe that. And I wanted to give the opposing argument the proper respect and airtime to come on and present their convictions and findings and make a case for that belief. While like you said, just full disclosure, I don't hold that belief, but I think we as kind of the spiritual theological descendants of the Bereans in Acts 17, right? We're supposed to test everything. We're supposed to examine what Scripture says and be noble that way. So kind of talk me through, Nick. How did you come to this place? Obviously, you must have been born again. You were a follower and disciple of Christ, and then but how did you land on this idea of was there any pivotal moment, or was there any teachers or mentors that kind of helped you land on a King James only belief? And I guess I should maybe back up and allow you to kind of define that a little bit too, and give some context of where you're at on sort of that spectrum of belief and conviction.
Yeah, so I grew up an atheist, and I became a Christian when I was 20. I had a miraculous experience, and since that time, I've followed Christ, love God. I've been actively involved with street preaching. I've been to Papua New Guinea 13 times.
Mm.
I lived in Pakistan for a year. So I've done a lot of evangelism, love just going out street preaching, one on one confrontation with tracts and things like that. And so the church that I first got involved with, they were sort of New King James. They didn't really have like a King James stance. But behind the scenes, some people were sort of talking about the King James is the best one. Just stick with the King James. And we just assumed the New King James was just an update of that. I've since sort of stopped reading the New King James, and I've gravitated toward the old. And I've actually done an update, the King James Version 2023 edition New Testament. So most hyper King James, as I would call them, people like Peter Ruckman and Ripplinger, they would say I'm a cultist because I've actually updated words like show from shoe into show, or believeth
Mm.
into believes, that type of thing. But I still get labeled continuously King James only by probably about 90% of people who are in the critical text camp. But so yeah, basically, I lived in Pakistan for a while as a Christian. My my main uh, my main issue with the textual, um, having a TR position and having a King James position, I used to promote the New King James a bit like what Dwayne Green does on his channel. He's promoting the New King James, and I was confronted on the issue of Easter, and I was told that it was a pagan festival. This is a horrible reading in the King James, and so I did a in-depth study into it. I studied everything that I possibly could. I wrote an article in 2005 on Easter, and I actually had David Crystal. He's one of the world leading experts in the English language. He read through it and said it was a good article. And my conclusion was that Easter was never a pagan festival. It's always been a Christian festival. Its etymology is not to Ishtar, but it's to Uster, which is a German word, which means from the east, and it's a shortened form of Auferstehung, which means resurrection. So
Mm.
Easter actually means resurrection, and so the King James Bible has it once, and it's in the Book of Acts, which is after the resurrection. So they purposely put it um, in the Bible. The word Pascha is usually translated as Passover, but the Old Testament feast had stopped and the New Testament celebration had begun. So that's why they put it in the Book of Acts, and because it's after the resurrection. And so after doing that study, I started to realize the New King James was a little bit deficient, and I started to gravitate away from that. I started to look more into the argumentation that King James proponents were making, and I couldn't find myself disagreeing with them. I just kept agreeing, and I kept saying, yeah, they've got a point. And to the point now where I've got full articles about errors in the New King James. And I think
Mm.
that they have followed sort of like conspiracy theories and followed just sort of sloppy scholarship to get to some of their conclusions. And I used to believe some of those conclusions, but I've sort of come out of that. And yeah, so that's how I sort of gravitated more and more toward the King James position. I've never really been a critical text person. Like I've never really jumped in and used an NIV or ESV or anything like that. When I was first saved, I had the Jehovah's Witnesses come to my door about 100 times in the first year of my salvation. So I was
Mm.
oftentimes debating with them about the Trinity and about the deity of Christ and things like that. And I found when I would be at a friend's house and the Jehovah's Witnesses would come around, I'd grab an NIV off their shelf and I couldn't argue the same way with the Jehovah's Witnesses. And
Mm.
so I just used to leave those modern Bibles alone and just sort of stayed within the Textus Receptus sort of corpus of Bibles.
Very interesting. So for our listeners, let me kind of unpack the discussion of the Easter thing, and I honestly don't remember off the top of my head, so I'm going to ask you, I guess. You're saying that the New King James Version. Well, let me back up and say it like this and ask it like this, I guess, is that in the Greek, of the New Testament, the word Easter is not present, but in the King James, in the 1611 and 1793 versions, the word there, Paschal, was translated into Easter. Am I correct so far?
So
And
yeah,
then
yeah,
in the
exactly.
New King James version, switches back to Passover, which I guess would be more of a transliteration of the Greek Pascha, which is a transliteration of the Hebrew Pesach. And you're saying that that's one of the points of contention you had with the New King James that eventually led you back to just having a six. Or was it? Do you read a 1611 or 1793 King James
Yeah, the 1769 was the most
or
major update.
1769? Sorry, yeah.
And so I do. There is a 1900 edition. Sometimes it's called the Pure Cambridge edition. That they sort of ironed out some of the print errors and things like that.
Mm,
Usually, if people say, where is the best one that I can get that out of all the King James printings, I point to that one. But it's
mm.
basically the 1769 update of Benjamin Blaney. So he just corrected a lot of print errors and things like that that were in the text.
Okay. Very cool. Very interesting. Now let me ask you, because I know there is a spectrum, and I've talked to a number of people after our podcast a number of months ago on the King James only movement. I have gotten some comments, I've gotten some emails, and it opened my eyes to this whole world that I didn't know even existed. I might even say like it's almost like a subculture of people. I don't mean to say that with disrespect, but it's like this. Um, Growing up in the deep South of the United States, the King James only movement is pretty much isolated, or people who adhere to King James only convictions, pretty much isolated to a handful of Christian denominations. And beyond that, a lot of evangelical Christianity just doesn't hold to that. I would say vast majority of evangelical Christianity, charismatic, or we could say like higher liturgical churches in the United States don't hold to a King James version only doctrine. So um, it's very fascinating. It opened my eyes so that there is a vast number of people who hold to that, and it almost in some ways seems like it's growing, but I can't quite confirm that. But I thought it was interesting because I wanted to kind of get into the minds of some of these folks and just better understand their convictions, because while I don't necessarily agree, I do want to understand so I can have better dialogue and make sure that I'm not wrong, but in discovering this whole kind of world of King James only adherents, I have come to learn that there is sort of a spectrum of people in terms of in their level of conviction of this absolutist kind of mindset towards the text. And I would say the one far extreme of that, if we could find like the borders of this spectrum, would be people like, I would say, the Ruckmanites, who would say, follow Peter Ruckman and say like the King James version as it was given in 1611. I think I'm representing his views correctly, would be divinely inspired, and that the King James version team in the 1600s, they were working under divine inspiration and guidance of the Holy Spirit, and that translation is akin to something like a Mount Sinai experience, where there is this collective revelation, and that the King James version almost had this pre-existent quality to it, that God then opened that revelation to the King James version translation team in the 1600s. And I think, and therefore that is perfect. And the 1611 King James Bible is without error, or you could say like the 1769 is without error. And in light of that, one could use that then to retroactively look at the parent texts of the Bible, like the Hebrew Masoretic text or the Greek Textus Receptus, and say, I can that all the words of the King James version can be used and should be used as a lens through which you interpret and translate the Hebrew and the Greek of the original Bible. And I would say I mean, do you agree? Is that kind of like one end of the spectrum in terms of?
Yeah.
And I'd say the other end is probably people who say, and very respectably, I would say, and well-intentioned, they would say, well, God's word needs to be preserved. There's passages that say not a jot or a tittle and so on and so forth, that God will keep his word safe from heresy, from corruption, and that the Hebrew Masoretic text, or at least one manuscript of the Masoretic text, and the Textus Receptus, those bodies of texts are uncorrupted by man and by scribal errors, and that any translation that is based on and chooses those particular manuscripts on which to base their translations, those are good translations. They're not perfect, and they wouldn't make that a hill to die on per se, but that the texts underlying any of those translations would be, those are divinely inspired. And so kind of place yourself, I guess, on that spectrum, if you don't mind.
Yeah, I guess like I believe the King James is without translational error because of the way that they translated it. They did it differently to how they do translations today. So they had a team of say 60 people. They're divided up into 6 companies, and so just say you've got 10 people in each company. Each one of those was given certain parts of the Bible that they were to translate. So 10 people had to say translate Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and maybe Revelation or something like that. So 10 of them translated by themselves. Then they were to amalgamate those 10 translations to one translation. Then they were to send that off to the other 50 translators, and they were all to read it. Then they would send back their information saying, look, you've missed this, or you've done this wrong, or whatever. And so all up, it was translated about 14 times. And this cross-referencing system made it so it wasn't like there weren't things missed. And I think there is a lot of common misconceptions about Bible translation and translation in general. A lot of people say you can't translate from one language to another. I know people who translate from English into Luxembourgish for the EU. And I asked them and said, they're a couple, and I just said, do you miss anything when you're translating? They said, no, we're fluent in English, we're fluent in Luxembourgish, we can do this. And they also knew German, and so a lot of the EU documents are in German as well, so they can double check with those. And they said they can bring everything across. There's nothing missed, and they're talking about financial issues, talking about nuclear weapons, talking about terrorism, talking about relations with other countries, and they can bring all of that information across. How come all of a sudden, when it comes to the King James Bible, the translators who were brilliant can't bring that across? And I think it's a common misconception that people say, oh, you can never translate anything properly. I think that these guys did do that, and I think they did a brilliant job. And I can't find fault in what they've done. And so, but just getting back to the question that you're asking about, you got like Peter Ruckman and Gail Ripplinger, people who believe, well, some of these people, they have a mix of belief, but ultimately the hyper King James, as I usually call them, they tend to believe in a secondary inspiration, where someone like myself, I believe that the Bible was originally inspired by God, but God promised preservation to us, that these words would be available to people who searched for the words of God. And so those words have been carried throughout time, all the way through to the printed editions of the Textus Receptus and the Masoretic text. And the King James is just simply a faithful edition of that. The Bible Society, for the first 100 years of their history, used the Textus Receptus, used the Masoretic text, and the translators were told to use the King James as their standard because it's the best standard that we have in the world. And so that's pretty much my position. Now I'm in a cult because I believe that. James White would say I'm a cultist because I believe what people believed 150 years ago. And so to me, something has changed. And what has changed is Unitarians took over the Bible societies. Unitarians helped Westcott and Hort with their text. They've taken out a whole bunch of Trinitarian verses that to do with the deity of Christ are weakened. And so a Unitarian influence on Bibles is huge. And now we have Trinitarians trying to defend a text that was basically designed and made by people who were compromised and people who were Unitarian. And so that's the main problem that I see.
Yeah, I think this is our last guest was talking about the Johannine. Is it Johannine comma that talks about the three the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, and that kind of but then later textual critics, adherents would say, well, that's in some of the newer Greek manuscripts, but not of the older ones. I think that's kind of one of the things I respect with when it comes to King James only adherents, or at least textual absolutist, let's say, would be a holy desire to want to make sure that false doctrine does not creep into the faith, and I think that's a really noble. But and I just answered the next question I was going to ask you is, like, why is it important to you, Nick, to be a King James only adherent? Why is that something you decided, I'm going to take an hour or 45 minutes of my time and come on the Beers and Bible podcast and defend it?
Yeah, I think it is important, and the more that I go through life, the more I realize it is of vital importance. Sometimes modern translations are just translated poorly, and so that's a whole different issue. But my main issue is with the underlying Greek text. So what you had is basically when someone like Mark Ward says, well, we've got texti recepti, we have lots of Textus Receptus editions, and they're not all the same, this type of thing. Well, most people just go with the underlying Greek text of the King James. So that's usually the Textus Receptus that we go with. So that's answered. But what we've got to think of, where was the critical text in the Reformation period? It didn't exist. Where was the critical text for like 1,500 years? It didn't exist. So what we're looking at is Westcott and Hort have a new Bible. They have Vaticanus and Sinaiticus, and they've put them together and said, this is the Bible. And so before that, basically there's just the Textus Receptus. And so you might have a few spatterings of, Luckman did a text and Tischendorf did a text leading up to Westcott and Hort. But Westcott and Hort had a Unitarian work with them who didn't believe in the Trinity, didn't believe that Jesus was God. And they fellowshiped with this guy. They had communion with this guy. He was an absolute heretic. He's like a Jehovah's Witness. And he helped with the Westcott and Hort text. So that's the foundation and basis for all the modern Bibles. So the Nestle Alarm text that people use today, the basis of that is the Westcott and Hort text. And people like Carlo Martini, who was in line to be a pope, he was instrumental. He was an editor of that text in the 1970s, from 1975. Like even just recently, a Jesuit, he died, I think it was 2019, and he's one of the main guys helping with the 29th edition. They've had Mormons help with the Old Testament text. So there's lots of heretics involved with this, and I can't understand how King James people are demonized as, you're in a cult and all the rest of it. Like James White will just say, I'm in a cult and I'm deceived. But I find that there's no looking in their own backyard and saying, look at all these heretics we've got hanging around Westcott and Hort. Guys who are in line to be a pope working on the Bible text. I mean, to me, that's troubling. And where was the Bible for like 1,500 years? It would just, like, the critical text was just not there. Vaticanus was sitting in, the Vatican Library. It was a curiosity. People used to look at it. Erasmus looked at it, and he said it's probably a back translation from a Latin document. It's so strange. Sinaiticus is only just recently found. But the thing is, too, there's the dating game. Oftentimes, manuscripts, like, say, the Museum of the Bible in 2020, they tested all their Dead Sea Scrolls with chemical testing, and they found them all to be forgeries. Some of these manuscripts are just dated as old, and therefore they override everything else. But how do we know they're not forgeries? They haven't tested Vaticanus. They haven't tested Sinaiticus. A friend of mine, Nehemiah Gordon, he recently tested Vaticanus, the dots that have to do with certain, they're called amulets, they're just dots in a margin. But he didn't really test the main body of text to date that. And so, but those dots went to the 15th century. So I think that Sinaiticus could be a forgery. It could be old, but we're basically taking it by faith. I think we have the technology today to date all of these manuscripts just like evolution is based upon false dating, or this bone is, 1 million years old or whatever, we really need to tighten up, and we need to start dating all of these things, because some of these things have been dated 150 years ago, and we just take it as a given that things are that old. And even the top scholars, like Kurt Aland, Barbara Aland, they were deceived by archaic Mark to think that it was a copy of Vaticanus. But in 2013, they found Prussian blue ink in this manuscript, which proves it's a modern day forgery. But they were sucked in to think it was a great manuscript, and they talked about it all the time. And now it's just seen as a nothing. And so I think, um, you know, basically what you have is the critical text is based upon Vaticanus and Sinaiticus, and maybe about 50 other manuscripts, where the Byzantine text that backs up the King James, the Textus Receptus, has 99.9% of all the rest. So you've sort of got like this Danny DeVito um, text, you've got this Arnold Schwarzenegger text, and they're said to be twins. It's like these two are very similar and all the rest of it. They're Alexandrian texts, but they actually differ 3,000 times just in the Gospels. So they're actually very different. These have been smashed together by Westcott and Hort and Unitarians. And so we've got this new text on the scene, never seen before, with 105 conjectural readings that just don't exist anywhere unless you smash these two texts together. And now this is the basis of all our modern Bibles. And I just think it's such a flimsy foundation to base everything on these weird texts that were rejected by the vast majority of people. They weren't copied, they weren't translated, and there's hardly any of them. To me, it makes more sense that you go with the vast majority that's out there, and you look amongst that for the correct readings.
Interesting. So let me ask you about the Dead Sea Scrolls, and you mentioned in passing that there's a chance they're forgeries. I mean, do you personally believe that the Dead Sea Scrolls would be forgeries? You think that the dating of being most of them being BC, or if not all of them being BC, would be erroneous?
I think when I was mentioning the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Museum of the Bible bought a handful
Mm-hmm.
of Dead Sea Scrolls, and they were proven to be forgeries. I think the Dead Sea Scrolls are genuinely old, but the ones that the Museum of the Bible bought, they tested them themselves and went, oh, they're all fake. And so they
Hmm.
basically may as well throw them all in the bin, but they spent a lot of money on them. So there are fakes out there, there are forgeries out there. And so that's why I'm like, we should test everything. We shouldn't just go, hang on, this is the oldest and best manuscript,
Mm-hmm.
without really, um, like, people on the critical text side should want to date these, because it should strengthen their apologetic. If it's
Mm-hmm.
truly like Sinaiticus is truly a 350 document, or Vaticanus, that would help with the strength of their case. But I think a lot of people are worried that they're going to test them and find out that I think Sinaiticus will be proven as to be a modern day forgery written in 1839. And Erasmus looked at Vaticanus, and he was an expert in manuscripts, and he said, I think it's a back translation from a Latin document. And he said it's probably been made at the Council of Florence, which was only like 100 years before him. So these weird manuscripts are now the best. They were rejected throughout all history, rejected by the Reformation, and now Westcott and Hort with Unitarian. George Van Smith said, hey, these are the best. And now they're the best, and they're the basis for all our modern Bibles. So that's why I have a problem with that text.
So as we're recording this, I actually saw an ad on Facebook yesterday for the Dead Sea Scrolls being on display at the Museum of the Bible in Washington D.C. I thought about flying up there and looking at them, and but I was like, I think I'm not. I think I'm going to hold off this time. I actually had the opportunity to view the Dead Sea Scrolls in the Museum of the Bible in Jerusalem, in the Shrine of the Book, and
Well,
really cool experience. They had the Leningrad Codex, if I'm not mistaken, or Aleppo, maybe one of the, I can't remember which one it was, on display there. Just to see those kind of documents with your own eyes is a real honor. But I wanted to kind of not push back per se, but I wanted to ask you: is there any official publication or document from the Museum of the Bible that talks about them being forgeries, or Is because I mean, I guess they're on display right now. They're still apparently charging admission to go see them and everything. But
Yeah,
um,
it's not the whole of the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's just
okay,
only the ones that they bought. So I think it was a
I
handful,
see.
and so they look like pieces of leather,
Yeah.
um, and they've just got script on it. But they tested those and they were proven to be fake. And I guess the only reason I brought that up is that I think everything should be tested.
Hmm.
Things that they have tested, like so that these, it's only just a handful of Dead Sea Scrolls that they've
I
tested
see.
in the Museum of the Bible, and that was in 2020. It's quite well known. It's not hidden or
Okay.
anything. It's in major newspapers and things like
But
that.
I guess there's some that are proven to be as old as scholars say they are. I guess is what you're
Yeah,
saying that they're just okay. Okay.
and so that's where I think everything should be tested.
Yeah.
Um, where some things just are not being tested at all. There's no one even talking about testing them. But to me, that just sorts out the sheep and the goats sort of thing of manuscripts. We don't want to be spending all our time looking at something and thinking that that's going to override or get rid of the woman caught in adultery story or get rid of the last 12 verses of Mark, and then later on go, whoops, no, actually that was genuine. And so
Sure. So let me ask you about the New King James, or I'm sorry, the King James Version translation team. I think they did a remarkable work. As I totally agree with you, and I agree with King James Version only adherence on that. That I am heavily reliant and really appreciate, and by default look at the Masoretic text and translations based off of the text. I look at those kind of being the foundation of every good translation. So I lean heavily on those texts. It's not, I'm not saying like I'm Eastern Orthodox where I've only looked at the Septuagint or anything like that. Um, and I do greatly value the work of the King James Version translation team. I think what they did was absolutely groundbreaking and revolutionary for their time. Um, is there anything in your studies that you've come across where the King James Version translation team says claims, I guess we could say absolutism, like imperfection in their translation? Is there any writings from any of the translation team that say, um, "Hey, this is the documents that we chose are the documents"? In other words, are there any claims by them that would help substantiate? Like I'm talking primary quotes or sources from that 60-person team where they would say, hey, if they could go in the future in 2025 and talk to Nick Sayers and say, you're absolutely right, our translation is perfect. Or I guess the documents in which where our translation is based are perfect.
yeah, there were several things that happened at 1611. So it wasn't just a translation; it was actually a culmination of everything, and not just in English, not just Greek and Hebrew, but every language. And so a lot of people don't realize this. In the dedication to King James, so in the front of King James Bibles, you might have the translators to the reader. Sometimes that's not there, but you might have the dedication to King James there. It's like 2 or 3 pages. And it actually says that they, out of the original sacred tongues, so Greek and Hebrew, and out of our own tongue, so the English, and foreign tongues. So they went through all the French Bibles, all the Ukrainian Bibles, all the German Bible. They went through everything that they could possibly look at, and they examined everything. So this is a definitive work of scholarship. See, a lot of people don't realize that they did that, and they say in that same line that they went to those three sources: the original sacred tongues, their own tongue, and foreign tongues, to make one more exact Bible. So more exact, it's sort of like an old way of saying one um, top Bible, one perfect Bible. The word exact would be like a perfect translation. So they said that their own work was perfect. There's two ways they describe perfect in the translators to the reader. One is the perfection of the word of God that comes straight from God, obviously the Greek and Hebrew, the originals. But then there's the perfect in a different sense of how someone can translate something. So they said that the other translations in English were good, but they said that they wanted to make one principle good one. So the word principle means like the capstone, the one that's right at the top of the pack. And so obviously we look at the Geneva, we look at the Bishop's Bible and Tyndale and others, and we go, yeah, that's good. But I can point out straight away where there's errors that even modern critical text guys would agree and say, yeah, that's an error. Like in the genealogy of Jesus in Matthew 1, they have an extra person.
Mhm.
Geneva and bishops have that. King James said it was these texts were corrupt, but then at the same breath they're saying they're good because they're good for salvation, they're good for doctrine, but they have these tiny little problems. So these got ironed out by the King James translators. So it wasn't just a translation, it was actually a culmination. And all the Greek text up until then, so you had Erasmus with his 5 editions, Stephanus 4 editions, Theodore Beza did 5. His 1598 is 99.99% of what the King James has. So the King James, there's only about 20 word differences between the Greek of Theodore Beza in his 1598 and the English King James text. And so that's why Scrivener, 250 years later, made a Textus Receptus for Westcott and Hort so that they could see where these tiny little differences are. He said there was 190 differences. I think 170 of those are completely untranslatable. So there's about 20 differences between what Theodore Beza has and the King James. So that's where I would say the Word of God. That's where I guess the scholarship of the King James translators, they actually created their own text, but it was so close to Beza that they didn't print another Greek text to say,
Hmm.
oh, here's the exact text. They just printed it in English and said, well, there you go, sort of thing.
So, are you of the mindset that the 1611 and then the 1769 they are in need of updating? Because obviously, like you're in Australia, I'm in the United States. Language changes based on geography, based on time. Um, what we're talking about now and what we're the words that we're using, even though we can understand each other in completely different continents, 400 to 500 years from now will be almost unintelligible by English speakers. What do we do then if we're King James Version only adherents? If we say, well, even a strict 1611 or 1769 only, at what percentage is it allowed to be unintelligible before we say, okay, it's time for an update? It's time for essentially a new translation. This is a language. So I was watching a YouTube video with my sons the other night, where this English language scholar. He's a linguist. That's the word I'm trying to think of. He studies the English language. He has a PhD in the history of the English language, and he was sitting on this armchair reading a story, a narrative that he had written, a short story, but he wrote it in a very fascinating way. In that the first few sentences were English that was from like the 4th century AD. And then every 3 sentences, he would jump a century in the evolution of the English language to where finally at the very end of the story, you understand the last 3 sentences. I mean, you can almost understand in some of like the last 9, but it kind of sounds like very Elizabethan. It's a little bit harder to understand, but it gets clearer and clearer as time goes on. So language undeniably changes through time and over space. But what percentage would you say, if you could put a percent on the 1769, is if it were unintelligible, you would say, okay, it's time for a new translation, essentially?
And I guess that's where Westcott and Hort were commissioned to do that. So they actually say in their preface, their edition is just an update of the 1611. So they're just telling people, hey, we're just updating language here. That's all we're doing. But what they did is they snuck in a never seen before Greek text, which has 2,900 less Greek words and 8,000 changes just in the Greek. But let alone the changes. See, the thing is, like, say, words like unicorn, which are in the King James,
Mm-hmm.
people think, oh, mythical horse with a horn, but the scientific name for a rhinoceros is Rhinoceros unicornus. One of the marginal notes in the King James says, or rhinoceros, or rhinocerots it has. Speaking of the unicorn, so that they were saying it's probably a rhinoceros, But in the New King James, it's a wild ox. But in Job, it says, "Can you tame the unicorn?" Obviously, it's rhetorical, saying you can't tame the unicorn, but you can tame a wild ox. That's why it's called a wild ox. And so it creates
Mm-hmm.
contradictions. And so
Mm-hmm.
that's just one small tiny
I think
example.
those are called like false friends. It's like a word that, like you mentioned, the word SHEW. Those are false friends. In other words, what they mean is like that there's words that have changed in their meaning. So if I were to open a 1611 and read the word, I can read it, I can understand it, but I think that I'm understanding it. But in fact, because that word has changed, to like suffer, for instance,
Yeah.
suffer them not. It's like we think we know the meaning, but it's a false friend. It actually meant something entirely different 400 years ago when the translator was on it. But I'm sorry to interrupt you if you want to continue.
And that's a really good point, because most people think a unicorn is a horse, a mythical horse with a
Mm-hmm.
horn, and lots of people do videos on this. Atheists will mock the Bible, but then when you explain, no, it's a unicorn is most probably a rhinoceros, and that's how they viewed that. There are many different types of unicorns. The mythical ones. There's legitimate ones. There's narwhals with the unicorn, one horn sort of thing. But that's a really good example of what you called false friends, which comes from Mark Ward. And most King James people understand that. Like D.A. Waite, who would be considered like a King James guy by, say, Dan Wallace and James White, he made the defined King James Bible. So things that were a little bit difficult to understand, he put in the margin. And the Trinitarian Bible Society have also done that. They've got, I think it's some sort of parallel Bible where they do that as well. Westcott and Hort's, that they were supposed to just update the language, so older words were easier to understand, and that's why I've done this, because that's usually the main objection. People say, well, what about what about certain wording? What about the grammar, the syntax? It's a little bit backwards. It's hard to understand. So, um, and I read the New King James for years and years and years, and then gravitated toward the old. And so I understand that people want readability, but people are afraid that when someone does a King James update, it's going to be a Westcott and Hort thing, because they deceived the people and they said, we're only just going to update things. We're only just going to update words here and there. And then they just created this whole new text, which is only 94% of the Textus Receptus. They chopped out 6% of the text. There's lots of changes. There's 8,000 changes in the Greek. There's
Yeah.
2,900 less words. And so people, I can understand why people don't want updates. They're like, well, we're tired of this I guess they feel like they've been through the COVID deception, and they're like,
Mm-hmm.
we don't want this. We just want to stick with the old thing. But sometimes what that can do, they can end up stuck in time. And I think if Westcott and Hort didn't turn up on the scene, there would have been a natural updating of some of these words. And I think the King James standard today would be just a little bit more readable for the average person.
So you would describe yourself as someone who would be pro updating the King James if done accurately and with care. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think like even someone like I disagree with Stephen Anderson on a lot of things, but when you watch his interview with James White, he says, "Look, I think believeth and believes are the same
Mm-hmm.
word.
Mm-hmm.
It's just one's old and one's newer. And most people are like that. You get some people who sort of say, no, you have to stick with the actual spelling of 1611 and all this sort of weird stuff. I don't think that at all. And that I think there is a movement toward a lot of people being a bit more relaxed to say, instead of, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son, that whosoever believeth, they can say whosoever believes,
Mm-hmm.
or whoever believes, this type of thing. And, some of the New King James is just an update, but some of it's not. And I
Mm-hmm.
guess that's the problem too. Some of the so-called updates of King James editions, like New King James and MEV, that are coming out we're just doing a cursory look and going, hang on, that's wrong, that's wrong, that's wrong. And there's lots of mistakes. And so, like 1 John chapter 3, verse 16 in the New King James omits the deity of Christ there.
Mm.
And it doesn't even have a footnote saying it's omitting it. It says the love of God, and then it talks about Jesus. So it says Jesus is God. The words of God are deleted. And to me, that's a problem. That's where I go, well, you said you're going to just be a new King James. You're just updating, but they're not. And many times in the Old Testament, they're changing lots and lots. Because I used to read the New King James, so I know these issues.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where I say, look, the King James to me is accurate. It represents the original Greek, the original Hebrew perfectly. But I understand there are readability issues. But the issue is too, the Greek that Paul was using, it would be considered the same type of difficult Greek that we would look at the King James and say, oh, that's difficult English. The Hebrew, the Hebrew that Moses wrote, when you come to the time of Jesus, they were looking at like archaic type of Hebrew. So it was about the same type of difficulty. So I can understand too people saying, well, you just got to look these up in a dictionary and then you'll get the correct words. And I mean, there's 1,000 Bible translations out there today. And so it is a bit messy. There's lots of problems with having too many Bibles out there.
Yeah. Yeah, I think one of the things in the first century they did to overcome that, if I'm not mistaken, was like you mentioned, obviously reading Mishnaic era Hebrew in the eighth, ninth, 10th century as a Jew would be cumbersome. It would be like reading Elizabethan English to us. So a lot of the Aramaic targums and stuff were developed and translated to kind of help mitigate that and make it more accessible. It's kind of like akin to the Septuagint would be to Greek speaking diaspora Jews who needed access to the scriptures. But so I think the problem would be if I'm ministering or sharing the gospel, and you mentioned earlier in the podcast that you do a lot of street evangelism or street preaching. If I'm talking to someone that doesn't, I think the average American or Australian would say, "Oh, okay, yeah, believeth." I'm good with that. But when we move into some cultures, and even here in the United States of America, there are places where the English that I'm speaking right now would be somewhat unintelligible to the listener. And so to take a King James version, whether it's 1611 or all the way up to a New King James, and hand it to them without any sort of explanation on some of these very important foundational texts in the Bible and commandments and prohibitions and just to be able to just open it and say, here's the gospel, read this, would be difficult in some cultures here, even just in the United States, let alone if I were to go to other English speaking countries. And I think the tension, I guess, is what I'm trying to kind of unpack is where are the parameters in terms of us being able to take the Bible and make it an approachable in text, in print, because we are commanded to read and study and teach the words of God in print. In your view and in your assessment, is that a permissible activity to say, like, here is something that you can read that is approachable to you and uses to the best of our ability your common vernacular? Is that something you would see permissible?
Yeah, like when I go to like Papua New Guinea and I'm street
Mm-hmm.
preaching there, people understand what I'm saying. When I tell a joke, they all laugh. When I say a sad story, they all look sad. They know what I'm talking about. But I've found when I've handed them King James Bibles, they struggle because
Mm-hmm.
they speak many languages up there. But we, as usually, Australian English, maybe Canadian and American, we tend to have a more in-depth understanding of the English language. We instinctively know that if you hear thou and thee, we sort of translate it in our head to you and this type of thing.
Mm-hmm.
With that, they struggle with that. So I've found they would constantly gravitate towards modern Bibles. So I would give them New King Jameses when I'd go up there, and try not to have any footnotes there, just sort of like, because I knew that they weren't going to read the King James at all. And
Mm-hmm.
there are many places around the world where they have English, like say in India, that 50 million people speak English as their first language. And but if you hand them a Bible that's King James, they would struggle with that. Where I've read it so often now, I don't struggle with it. I understand it. I'm reading it all the time, but I can understand that struggle for a lot of people. And like you're saying, there's some people in some poorer parts of town where people aren't educated, to our level, or some people who are new Americans or new Australians, they're foreigners, they could struggle with this. And so, usually, what I say to people is, look, you read this, but I always point to the King James is 100% perfect. So if they ever get stuck on something, they can always go back and study something out in the future and go, well, that's what the word means there. And so, um,
Hmm.
yeah,
Interesting conversation. Yeah, I really appreciate the heart that you have. It's one, I've come across a lot of, and maybe it's kind of isolated here to the United States, but a lot of King James only adherents are. I would say James White is right in describing some of them as being almost cultish in their motivation. It's there, and I think to provide better context, I think James White is speaking to kind of a cultural and denominational subset of Christians in the United States that um, have other cultish behaviors and doctrines, pet doctrines, maybe we would say, that are clearly, something that we would so point out and say, yeah, that's an error, that's a cult. So I don't like that he was maybe throwing out a blank or painting with a wide brush and saying that anyone holds to this belief is a cult. I think that's an unfair assessment, because I think, like yourself, there's a lot of people that are very well intentioned and are just really after doctrinal purity, looking at the main tenets of Christianity as Scripture tells us, and saying, "Hey, if there's any erosion of these, we need to call it out, and we need to be mindful of that, and sort of like in a shepherding role." And that I can get behind that all day long. I think that's very, very noble. But it's a very thought provoking conversation. And given me a lot to think about and to ponder, and I hope it's been insightful to those listening to the podcast. If nothing else, I think by having two opposing viewpoints coming on, it shows that Christian brothers can have civil dialogue about our scripture, and at the end of the day, come away from this conversation and say, "Hey, I may not agree, but I love you, and I would lay my life down for you because you're made in the image of my Creator. You're a disciple of my Savior, and you've given your life to Him." And I think that's, if nothing else, hopefully our listeners have taken that away, is that there is the ability to have these dialogues and these conversations in a loving and civil way that doesn't degrade or profane our risen Savior. So, Nick, I want to say thank you again for your time tonight and coming on the podcast. And yeah, I hope, let me ask you this, is there anything in Australian English that you're aware of that is completely different than American English? Maybe we can end on that
yeah.
note. That would be fun.
Well, it's interesting. Here in Australia, we have
Hmm.
give way signs. They're like the upside down triangle signs, and it
Okay.
says give way.
Give way.
Where
Hmm.
in America it's yield, and
Yes. Yeah.
we never use yield, or we might use it and we don't realize it, but
Yeah.
it sounds so like, not 1600s. It's like yield,
Really.
it just seems so strange.
Yeah.
And it's like saying when you throw something like yeet or something. It was
Yeah.
very
Yield.
different. There are quite a few differences in American language compared to Australian, but we tend to be very British,
Hmm.
but now we follow America, and so we sort of know
Hmm.
both.
Yeah.
We've got a lot of British people in our culture, and so we tend to adopt a lot of idioms and things that come from the Brits.
Sure.
But yeah, definitely yield is one of those ones that we don't use that often down here.
That's really funny. Cool, man. Well, I appreciate you being a fellow Bible nerd and passionate follower of Christ. And anytime you're in the lower Alabama area, please stop by and you have a place to stay. So, but Nick, I appreciate it, and have a great evening.
Cheers, Gabe. Thanks, mate.
All right, everyone listening, thanks again for listening to another episode of the Beers and Bible podcast. I don't know what episode number this is. That's Josh's job to keep track of that. It's probably something like 140 episodes that we've got, but we'll let Josh sort that out when he gets back in. So thank you for listening. If you got any questions, comments, feedback, send us an email. Beards and Bible Podcast at something. This is another one of Josh's job. I don't even know our email address, Nick. That's embarrassing. You can send me an email. How about that? GabrielRutledge@gmail.com. And I'll make sure I forward it over to Josh, and Josh he's going to have to answer it. So, but thank you guys so much. Check us out on Facebook and like our page on there. We've got a lot of updates and different things we do via Facebook. So thanks again for listening. Talk to you guys later.